Good morning, everyone. Today is Brexit Day. Brexit post 3 years. Our speaker this morning is Amie Kreppel, full professor of political science at UF and the founding director of the Center for European Studies. So she's the head honcho. That's right. Carla Ruffer works for Amie. And Carla, of course, is the lady who put this program together. Amie is a world traveler by anybody's standards. She's taught all through Europe, Paris, Brussels, Austria, Rome, Florence. She's held positions at the university, the institute at Florence, European Institute. So I don't know how she kept up with all of that. She got her PhD from UCLA in 1998, and she's been on the run ever since. So we're glad that she could take time out from her busy schedule. I think she's flying to Croatia in a couple of days.
I'm flying to San Diego.
Oh, San Diego. And then, yeah. And so we're really, really very happy to have you here. And I'll turn the floor over to Amie.
Thank you so much. I told you when I got my PhD, so I feel kind of outed. Tells you how long I've been around.
Done a lot in that.
Okay.
Yeah. That was me.
Okay. Okay, so welcome everyone. I see some familiar faces, and I know that some of you have heard me talk about Brexit, if not once, multiple times. So some of this may be somewhat redundant. It'll be a refresher. I do have some new things to add. I continue to like to laugh at the British, so I will continue to do that. I continue to think that Brexit is and remains and perhaps will always be one of the greatest examples of national self-harm outside of starting a war, actually. So we may have a new taker on that. Okay, so what we're talking about now is Brexit after the fact. The last time I came here, Brexit was about to be fully implemented, but it had not yet happened. And obviously there are some other things that have happened in the same time period, such as COVID, which I know you're all familiar with. So it makes the discussion of the impact of Brexit a little bit more difficult to decipher, but we're gonna go ahead and try anyway. Let's see if I can remember forward. Here we go. Let's start by thinking about what actually Brexit is. What do we mean by Brexit? So you can see that the way I think about Brexit really is as a series of tests, right? It was a test of many things. Brexit was a test of the unity of the remaining EU member states. It was a test of the capacity of the EU member states to actually manage an exit of a member state, which they had not anticipated. Despite including the opportunity for exit inside their treaties, really, when they were drafting it, no one thought that it would actually happen. And so, as we'll see, the definitions and the process for it weren't very well defined, weren't very well thought out. They put it in there just to have it, just in case, but they didn't really think it was going to work. So the fact that they were able to make it work is actually evidence of the strength of the institutions. It was also a test of public support for the EU. When the original vote for Brexit happened, there was initially a great deal of fear that this would be a domino effect, that after Brexit, we'd have Grexit, we'd have Frexit, we'd have Jexit. People were coming up with every kind of rhyme they could think of. And public opinion polls, as we'll see, quickly put that to bed and demonstrated that in actuality, the impact of Brexit has been to boost support for the European Union for a number of reasons that I will discuss. It's also, to a certain degree, a test of the resilience of the EU political class. I assume that you all watch the news a little bit, so I don't think I have to tell you too much about how they have done on that test, because it's not so good, okay? It's a test of the resources of the UK administrative structures and a test of the unity of the UK itself, which is part of the title of this talk, right? From Great Britain to Little England. So overall, the EU has outperformed. And it's not really surprising when you think about it. The EU is 27 countries and they have a lot of resources. The UK is one country. And so they understandably have fewer resources. But it was the UK that decided to walk down this path, and it was the UK that decided to put itself to these tests, as well as to force the EU to take these tests. So what are the origins? These are just the factual origins, right? Originally, the treaties that led to the creation of the European Union, they began with the European Economic Community. You could go back to the European Coal and Steel Community, but the 1957 treaties, which created the European Economic Community, did not have an exit clause. There was no way to leave, and unlike the Coal and Steel Community Treaty, which preceded them, there was no end date, right? The Coal and Steel Treaty was a 50-year treaty. It actually ended. They had a little party. It was fine. But the European Economic Community was a treaty ad infinitum. No exit, no end, okay? And over time, it became clear that not everybody that was a member state should be a member state or should stay a member state. And this question first came up actually in the 1990s when Austria had an election that led to Jörg Haider and his People's Freedom Party being the most popular party in Austria. And this is a party of the far right. It is a leader of a party who supported or vocally spoke in support of Nazism, used rhetoric that was extremely caustic. And the rest of the EU member states suddenly realized that this could be a prime minister sitting in their meetings. This could be someone with whom they would have to engage. And so they developed, and they didn't have any institutional structure within the EU to react to that. So the only thing that could happen was bilateral discussions and each individual country effectively sanctioning Jörg Haider's party so that he could not actually become the prime minister. But it had to happen on a member state by member state basis. The EU had no tool to manage that. So they developed what's called Article 7. And if you follow the rule of law concerns in the European Union, particularly with Hungary, but also with Poland and some other countries, you'll often hear this referred to as an Article 7 process. And what the Article 7 clause did was it gave the other member states the opportunity to sanction shifts towards non-democracies within other member states. But here again, and this is a separate lecture y'all will have to invite me back for, the EU didn't really think as much about the potential problem as they should have, because the decision-making function for Article 7, which allows essentially a member state to be kicked out, right? So it's a kind of exit. You can be kicked out. It requires unanimity of all the other member states. So in the current situation where we have Hungary and Poland, it's been very difficult to implement in any way the Article 7 clauses because Hungary protects Poland's back and Poland protects Hungary's back. So we're going to work still on fixing that particular constitutional problem. But the idea of a country being kicked out made people think about a country just deciding they wanted to leave, right? If you can be kicked out, you should be able to leave of your own free will. And that led to the creation of Article 50 and the Article 50 process in the Lisbon Treaty. So the Lisbon Treaty, which is the most recent significant treaty, it was adopted in 2009 or implemented in 2009. That treaty allows for countries to voluntarily leave. They can, through whatever process they need to do domestically, they can decide that they want to leave the EU, and then there is a formal process for them to go through to exit. And I'm going to give you a very brief summary of that process because it's kind of long and annoying. In the case of Brexit, there was a long history of EU skepticism that we call Euroscepticism, and it dates almost from the moment of entry. Keep in mind that the UK was not one of the original members of the EU. They were invited to join. Actually, they were invited to join the coal and steel community. They declined. They were invited to join the European Economic Community in 1957. They declined. And then, as some of you may know, in the 1960s and early 70s, the UK actually went through a very difficult economic period while the rest of Europe was emerging from the devastation of World War II, while Germany was experiencing the beginning of its economic miracle, while France and Italy were rebuilding and doing well economically. the UK was actually having a great deal of hardship. They were in recession. They had energy shortages. They had rationing of several important commodities. And so the UK went to the EU in the late 1960s and said, hey, can we join? And initially, because of France and because of de Gaulle, the European Economic Community said, we're good. You said no, you stay out. And they did that until 1973. Political shifts in France primarily, but also some international events led for the other member states of the economic communities to welcome the UK in. But there's a lot of tension there. Anybody who's been to the UK, spent time in the UK, I have a friend who's from the UK. He's lived in the US for a very long time, teaches at UC San Diego, but I won't be seeing him. He was going to be back in the UK over summer, and I teach a summer in Brussels program. And I said, oh, you're over there. You should come over, give a lecture to my class. He goes back to the UK every summer, okay? He said to me, that would be great. I haven't been to Europe in forever. And he didn't do it consciously. He didn't think about, being rude to Europe, but in his mind, despite the fact that he is not Eurosceptic, UK is not Europe. And that divide is very deep, right? That feeling is very deep. It goes through centuries of history that most of you are familiar with. So it's very easy to have Euroscepticism in the UK because people don't feel necessarily European. They don't identify as European. And Euroscepticism divided both major parties in the UK. So it's what we call a cross-cutting cleavage, making it more difficult to manage politically. It's not that the Tories are universally, now more so, but historically, the Tories weren't universally Eurosceptic and Labour wasn't universally pro-Europe. In fact, both parties were deeply divided. They came in under a conservative government. They left under a conservative government. So there's not a partisan divide there in the UK. But they have had a Eurosceptic stream through both parties. In this case, in the UK, what you had from 2000 on was the rise of UKIP, which is the UK Independence Party. It's a small party. Ironically, they got their start in European Parliament elections. And that's because while elections in the UK are similar to the ones we have here, called first past the post, right? Whoever gets the most votes wins. Elections in the rest of Europe and elections for the European Parliament are proportional elections. You get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats, more or less. And so these smaller parties that could never have success in regular national UK elections actually won seats to the European Parliament. So UKIP, UK Independence Party, a nationalist party, a party that is against the European Union, got its start, its success, and its funding by winning seats to the European Parliament. I think if you look up irony in the dictionary, that is what you find. So UKIP became very popular, and in a response, the UK Conservative Party developed inside of itself a faction called the European Research Group. ERG is European Research Group. It's not formal, but it is a group within the Conservative Party of hardcore European skeptics. And they lobbied inside the Conservative Party for very strong rhetoric against the UK, okay? And so what happens, against the EU. So what happens is we have here, it's the 2008 economic crisis. It hits Europe in 2010, and it is a deep economic crisis. And it is followed almost immediately by a refugee crisis spawned by the Arab Spring, which was supposed to be a moment of spreading of democracy, but it led to vast waves of refugees, particularly from Syria. And the EU received millions and millions of refugees from the Middle East. And that was, again, probably the topic of another lecture. And because the ERG within the Conservative Party was really pressuring David Cameron, who actually was not Eurosceptic, he was prime minister, he decided to go wild and to make a pledge. At the time, the Conservatives were actually governing with a Liberal Democrat Party and a coalition, which is very unusual for Britain. But polls suggested that that coalition was going to be necessary in the 2015 election. That's what it suggested. So David Cameron said, okay, look, if we win an outright majority, which isn't going to happen, if we win an outright majority, I will hold a referendum on Brexit, okay? And he made this promise really never expecting to have to implement it because all of the polls suggested that there was no way the Conservatives were going to get an absolute majority. But the polls were wrong, as they often are, and the Conservatives got an absolute majority. And so David Cameron had to hold a public referendum on Brexit, okay? But with a deeply divided party. So we had this referendum, and David Cameron was fighting for control of his own party. And so while he maintained that he was pro-EU, right, the pro-EU folks called Remainers, to be remaining in the EU, they led a campaign that was very standard. You know, it's got a nice little heart. We love the EU, Remain, you know, words. Whereas the Brexiteers, they ran a campaign of fear and often straight out lies. This image of the refugees making you think that they're marching down the streets of Dover, right? That's actually from a border with Hungary, and it's from years previous to this actual election campaign, okay? So it has nothing to do with the UK. These people are never getting anywhere near the UK, but it is a fear-inducing image, right? Because on the news, you do have the refugee crisis. People are afraid of masses of refugees coming in. This has undisputedly been proven to be a lie. It was a lie then. Everybody knew it was a lie then, but it sounds really good. The NHS is the National Health Service. Obviously, people care about their medical care. They have nationalized health care in the UK. So this is what everybody uses unless you're very wealthy. But it had been under strain, and people had been having long waits, and people couldn't always get in when they needed to. And so this campaign, let's fund our NHS and not send it to bureaucratic Brussels, was very impactful, okay? Again, based basically on lies. So the Vote Remain campaign, the Remain campaign was very weak, very lackluster, because they assumed they were going to win. Polls suggested, and apparently they still paid attention to polls, that they were going to win. It might have been a little bit close. They expected maybe, 4 or 5 percentage points, but they were going to win. And in fact, this guy up in the, I don't know how to make the light work. Here, light. This guy, he's Nigel Farage. He's the leader of UK Independence Party. Farage said in all of his public speeches, look, this is such an important issue. If Remain wins 52-48, it's not settled. We'll need to have another vote. It's too close, right? Because the expectation is that Remain was going to win, but not by that much, okay? But in fact, that's a lot of words. Just ignore it. I tried to put in purple what you need. This is just the actual text. And you guys can have this anywhere you want. It's on the computer here. But what happened in the referendum was that Leave won by exactly the margin that Farage predicted Remain would win. Leave won 52-48 with relatively low voter turnout. And as I'll show you in a minute, it was overwhelmingly a result of low turnout among young people. If you held this is a terrible thing to say in here probably, but if you held the referendum today and everybody voted exactly the same way, the results would be different because seniors were overwhelmingly in favor of Leave and young people were overwhelmingly in favor of Remain. Yes, I know, you'd think the war. It's actually very different than what happened in France anyway, that's another question. Yes, but that is the way, largely because of where more senior people live. They tend to be more rural. They weren't in the urban centers. The urban centers tended to coalesce with more favor for Remain. We can talk about it during our question time. But if the vote were held today, everybody voting exactly how they voted, the results would be different, okay? Just because of aging out. So basically what Article 50 says, it's very vague. Article 50 says you can decide as a member state to leave whenever you want by whatever method is appropriate for your constitution, your country. Once you do that, to make it official, you have to tell us. And all that means is you have to literally write us a letter, 2 sentences that says, we hereby say that according to Article 50, we are going to withdraw from the EU. Okay. It took him about 7 or 8 months after the Brexit vote to actually do this. David Cameron resigned. Theresa May came in. Theresa May said, Brexit means Brexit. Nobody knows what that means. We still are working on that. And she eventually wrote the letter and sent it over to Brussels, starting the Brexit process. According to the treaties, there's my light, 2 years after notification, 24 months after notification, you're out. Now, it might happen faster if we can come to an agreement. If we can get our trade agreement or an exit agreement, a divorce agreement faster, cool. But if not, 2 years, 24 months, you're out. That is crazy, okay? There's so much connection that nobody thought about. And the UK was really the best case scenario. The UK is not part of the social charter. The UK is not part of Schengen, meaning free movement. The UK is not part of the Eurozone. So in many ways, other than actually Croatia, which had just joined a couple of years prior, the UK should have been the easiest case of exit because there was the least amount of stuff to unwind. But just to begin with the things they didn't think about, no planes could take off from the UK and land in the EU without an agreement. No planes, because there has to be an agreement there. The nuclear power plants in Scotland had to be shut down because the UK long ago gave up its independent control over nuclear regulatory, and that's now done through a European nuclear regulatory agency, but they were no longer members. Something that affects all of you. There's something called the Fly America Act and Open Skies Agreement. So I have a federal grant. I can only pay for your airline tickets if you fly on an American carrier, or because of the Open Skies Agreement with the EU, an EU carrier. Up until Brexit, could have flown you British Air or Virgin. Now I cannot. Okay. They didn't think about patent law. They didn't think about the London as the home, the FTSE 100, and London as a financial market. All of that got shut down. Many agencies moved. Lloyd of London, their base is now in Dublin. They haven't changed their name because they would have been unable to work in the rest of Europe had they stayed with their financial base in London. So the amount of legislation and the amount of things that had to be adapted, you could list them. And there's a fellow, Dan Kellerman, on Twitter, if you follow Twitter, who did a series of tweets, unexpected consequences of Brexit. And every day he would just take a couple of things and tweet them. I think he got up to about 3,000 and then he just stopped because he was exhausted. But he would just constantly list these things that would come up. One of the most egregious of which is the Northern Ireland Agreement and the Good Friday Agreement, which we'll talk about. But any area of legislation that you can think of, the UK had been integrated into Europe, and severing those ties is extremely difficult. And obviously there's an imbalance. If the UK wants to withdraw, sure, there are some companies in the rest of Europe who work with the UK or deal with UK industries. They're going to be negatively affected. But they've got 26 other countries to try to fill that gap. But for the UK, as much as it is separated geographically, right, it's an island from the EU, it is closer to the EU than it is anybody else. So if it needs to find a new producer for a goods or a new place for its services, it's got to go really far away, right? It's going to have to go far away to find that. And that's not only going to be more expensive, but it's going to be more difficult to negotiate. And what has resulted actually is that most industries have continued to work with their European partners because it makes the most sense, but now they have extraordinary additional costs in time and money because of the bureaucracy and the paperwork. Another thing that really annoyed Brits was that they had to go through the other visa line. You know, when you go into a country, there's like the short line. When you come back into the US, you got the short line for US citizens, right? Well, they were used to having the short line. Now they're in the long line, and they have to pay for visas. And their car insurance doesn't work, and their medical insurance doesn't work, and they can't bring their dog anymore. I mean, any number of small annoying things that if all of a sudden this happened between us and Georgia, right, and you wanted to go to Georgia, but now you had to bring some ID, and you couldn't bring your dog, and you had to change your car insurance, and you had to change your health insurance. When you're used to just driving to Georgia for whatever reason, you want to go see Savannah, whatever, right? So the difference, the amount of day-to-day activities was enormous, okay? All right, I'm probably running out of time. Oh, one thing I want to point out, go back, go forward, go back, is this right here. And this is really important. And this is, if this country wants to rejoin the EU, it's got to go through the whole process that any other candidate country would want to go through. There is no shortcut. And critically, there are no opt-outs. So the UK, having been a member when the euro was adopted, it opted out. It said, you keep your euro, I'm going to keep my British pound. The UK was a member when the social charter was adopted. Social charter is worker protections and things like that. And they said, you do that, we don't want to. Schengen, we're an island nation, we don't want to do it. Okay, so they opted out, and they were allowed to opt out because they were already members, and they could say, we don't want to do that. But now they're not members. So should they ever want to join, they will get a far worse deal because they will not be allowed any opt-outs because new members never are, and they will be treated as a new member. Okay, so that is important. All right, so formally, the 29th of March, 2017, the UK invoked Article 15. There was a withdrawal agreement. It was supposed to be completed within 2 years, as I said. That did not happen. It was extended all the way through December of 2020, which was really bad timing, if you can remember sort of what happened in March of 2020, right? That was COVID. So they were trying to manage the negotiation of Brexit while peak COVID was happening. And you can think about things like sharing medical equipment, access to vaccines, negotiating contracts for things like that. So while the rest of the European countries were working really hard to develop networks of medical care, the UK was on its own. They got their own in the end because AstraZeneca is a UK company, and AstraZeneca committed a bunch of vaccines to the EU. The EU paid AstraZeneca for it, and then the UK government put down export controls and said, no, you can't ship to the EU. So that was fun. So there's a lot of good feeling now between the UK and the EU. So it was extended January 1st of 2021. We have the nearly full implementation of Brexit. It's not all the way full because like the EU took pity on the UK and said, okay, you can fly your planes. We'll do a temporary agreement. And okay, you can bring your truckloads of goods in. We'll minimize the amount of paperwork because otherwise they really would have caused great physical harm to UK citizens. And the EU didn't want to be responsible for that, right? Had the EU not done these things, there would have been medicine shortages. There would have been food shortages. There would have been agricultural supply shortages. People would have been harmed. And the EU was not willing to take that responsibility, even just for spite, like even just because they kind of wanted to, for the UK, but they weren't willing to do it. So they made a lot of accommodations where public safety or public health was concerned, and that minimized the immediate impact of Brexit. So this is just some things that happened as a result of it. There's free movement of people, trade in goods. You can see the difference between the current agreement and what an EU member state gets. So now there are border checks on goods. You need, as I said, pet passports. And as someone who had to get one once, they are a pain. You don't have visa-free travel anymore. The roaming fees was huge. The UK citizens went crazy over this because before this, your cell phone, you could go anywhere in the EU and you never had roaming fees, including your data and everything. But now all these business people who are going to the continent, they are paying outrageous roaming fees because they no longer fall under that piece of legislation. That was a big one. Trade, obviously there's no longer frictionless trade. You have custom formalities, you have safety protocols, checks, you have origin procedures and the fisheries agreements. The yellow is where they're still working on a compromise, but they haven't received it. And this is just a very small selection of the things that changed in the UK as a result of leaving. In my own world of education, we have seen a mass exodus of academics out of the UK, which used to be able to import them. So it used to be, a lot of research is done in English, right? Scientific research in particular, but also social sciences. And so a lot of scholars from all over Europe would go to the UK, not only to perfect their English in graduate school, but then stay on some of the best universities, and being able to work in English is just going to be a lot easier. And they were able to access all of the funding for research and grants that come from the EU. My own Jean Monnet researches that, but also Horizon 2020, which is a huge, it's like the NIH and the DoD put together. Like it's a big research pot, right? But now you can't have that money in the UK. And so those scholars who had funds to themselves and their projects, they had to leave the UK if they wanted to keep those research grants. And so universities all across Europe had a huge boon. It was just open season. You could just pick any academic and go, thank you, and go. And academics currently in the UK can no longer apply for most of those grants, or if they apply in the same way that I do, as a third party, like a third member state. So there's many grants that I cannot apply for, or if I apply for them, I have to have an EU partner, okay? So academically, they also lost a lot of money. And also you were talking about Erasmus. Sarah Agnelli came and talked about Erasmus to folks. Well, the UK is no longer part of Erasmus. And the UK was a huge site for Erasmus, again, because of English. And so now Ireland is like, what are we going to do with all these students? Because everybody who wanted to go to the UK to learn English and to perfect their English through Erasmus, their only option now is Ireland, right? And interestingly, college and grad school applications from European countries to the US have gone up as a result of Brexit, because we are another source for in-English education, okay? Now that the euro is lower, it may be less so. So the future relationship, this is from an EU website. So this is the agreement. They're working very hard. This is the trade and cooperation agreement. The EU actually is trying very hard to keep trade alive, partially out of self-interest. There are some products in the UK that are really vital. Some of you may have heard of the Eurofighter, right? That's their big fancy warplane. Well, the Eurofighter was an example par excellence of EU integration. But it turns out the wings were designed and made in the UK. And so, for example, they really need those wings to keep that plane afloat. And so the EU does have some interests in maintaining, at least temporarily, ties with the UK until they can find alternative sources. But that sort of very high-tech stuff, that's going to be difficult. The same is true for some of their satellite materials and part of their space program. And so where it interests the EU, they obviously want to keep those relationships alive. There is also an interest in protecting people. Most of the EU member states created a short track for obtaining citizenship or residency for UK citizens who had been in those countries for 2 years or more. So a lot of UK citizens who were resident in Germany or France or Spain were able to fast track citizenship so that they could stay in those countries, because otherwise they would have lost all their rights. They were hoping that that would be mirrored by the UK. It has proven more difficult for EU citizens to gain permanent residency and permanent status in the UK, although they are still working on that. So again, this is just a lot of information that you can look at later, but the idea is that they have managed to come to a fair number of agreements, right? So it has happened. They have been able to negotiate and come to agreements in a number of different areas, largely where both of them would be better off. The EU and the UK would be better off if they could find a solution to the problem, right? And so both of them had incentives. Where there's conflict, where one side loses more than the other, then obviously it becomes more difficult to reach these agreements. They are still negotiating. It has become increasingly difficult given the instability in the British government, but which is a crazy thing to say, actually. Those two terms, instability and British government, are not things that I am used to saying. I'm an Italianist. I study Italy. So there was an Economist cover that looked at the UK as if it were Italy. And it was funny because it has increasingly seemed more like Italian politics there. So what's the impact of Brexit? This is the meat of the talk, right? What is the impact of Brexit? I'm focusing the impact of Brexit on the UK. Okay, I have talked in the past about the impact of Brexit on the EU, but just now with a couple of years of actually having been out, what have we seen? And I'll talk about it politically, economically, and systemically, okay? So what is the impact? The most important one, and it's one that has been all over the news, is that it has been utterly catastrophic. It has had a catastrophic impact on the political parties of the UK. Absolutely devastating, okay? The party system, which has been stable for the entire post-war period, and honestly, pretty stable even since World War I, is in upheaval, okay? Both parties are deeply divided. We have had the shortest lived prime minister ever, 44 days, which actually is shorter than Italy's shortest ever reigning prime minister. So they win the award there, which is crazy. But there was a tweet from another friend of mine who said that his 6-month-old son had now lived through 3 prime ministers and 2 kings and two monarchs, right? That level of instability in a UK context, it is very difficult. It's difficult for citizens to adapt to. It's difficult for the political structure to adapt to because, I mean, we joke about it, but Italy and Italian bureaucracy and Italian lawmakers, they're used to it, right? They are used to it. They have found mechanisms to function. They have rules in place to manage that instability because they've had it for 50 years. And so they don't love it. It's not great, but they can manage it because they're used to it. The UK doesn't have any of those structures. They don't have any of those mechanisms. They don't have the capacity to continuously manage that level of instability. And so what we're seeing is a lack of capacity. Decision-making has been harmed. And the UK used to be the example that in the Intro to Comparative Politics class, I would say, here is a political system that is decisive, efficient, it works, you know, and then I talk about Italy. So it's not that example anymore. I have to find a new example, which is difficult because Germany doesn't fulfill it. France doesn't. I mean, I don't know who to use anymore. It's getting kind of tough. But it's had a catastrophic impact on the party system. It's left the country as a whole deeply divided, deeply divided. It has reinforced age differences. So young people feel very disengaged from politics. They feel cheated by the way that Brexit happened. And granted, many of them didn't vote, so I kind of think like it's on them. But it harms them more than anybody, right? Young people today can't do Erasmus. Young people today can't go on summer tour in Europe easily. Young people today can't go work in Europe on a whim. Young people today can't get their degree recognized in Europe. Young people today can't go easily get a job in Europe without any paperwork, right? To hire somebody from the UK now in the rest of Europe is as hard as it is to hire me. The paperwork, like the green card access, all of that, it's just as hard to hire a Brit as it is to hire me. I mean, so obviously they're going to hire me. No, I'm just kidding. But it makes it very, very difficult now for young people to have the kind of success and economic forward momentum that the older generations had. And they are bitter about it. They are angry, okay? And understandably, although again, tell your grandkids to go vote because that's what happens if you don't vote. It's also created deep geographic cleavages. There are clear geographic, I'll show you a map in a minute, but there are clear geographic differences between areas that voted Remain and areas that voted Brexit. And those areas that voted Remain sometimes overlap with national identities. And that reifies distinct cleavages between obviously Scotland and the Scots and the rest of England, right? The rest of the UK. And they feel that they were dragged out. And there's a lot of resentment about that. And then there's also just a deep backlog of issues. Over the last 3 years, they have not been able to pass legislation or address any problem other than Brexit and COVID. Right? Education reform, NHS reform, Social Security reform, health and housing reform, increased homelessness that they have not been able to address, increased unemployment that they have not been able to address, infrastructure that they have not been able to address. There have been no major pieces of legislation on anything other than Brexit and COVID. Now, COVID's not their fault. It just happened to coincide with Brexit, and that is very bad luck. But it means that there is a backlog and a frustration among citizens that is increasingly visible because things just aren't getting done. And again, there's no history of things not getting done. Like in Italy, they'd be like, yeah, things don't get done. But in the UK, the expectation is for stability and efficiency and for things to get done. And that's part of where this dissatisfaction and frustration is coming, okay? So that's a problem. So here's how the different age groups voted. Remember I mentioned that age is a big difference? It's overwhelming. I mean, in statistics and political science, this kind of correlation, this is a happy dance. This never happens. I mean, your R squared here, for those who know what that means, is like 87%, okay? The younger you are, the more likely you were to vote Remain. overwhelmingly, and it's only become stronger. So this was the actual vote, but if you ask people today, how would you vote or would you like to go back? It's even more strongly related. And this creates a real divide between generations, which is problematic, right? You need a society where old and young can work together. This is the education gap. It's almost as strong. The more educated you were, the more likely you were to vote to stay in Europe. And that's, again, a very high correlation, very strong, and only getting stronger. And that's because, honestly, I mean, I know we have our own issues here, but there is no way that I can intellectually understand how anyone who knows anything could think that Brexit was economically a good idea. Like, you may have ideas about culture and identity, and that's personal, but economically, there's no potential scenario in which you can look at it, or anybody could look at it, from Nobel-winning economists to green grocers who have to import their goods, and say, yeah, this is a good idea. Let's just shut ourselves off from our largest trading partner, where 60% of our exports go. Let's put tariff barriers on 60% of our exports. I think that's a good idea. I think that'll help the economy. Said nobody ever. There's also a wealth gap. The richer you were, the more likely you were to support Brexit. I'm sorry, to support Remain. So again, college education is heavily correlated with wealth, and so these things overlap, right? And it's ironic, again, because these people who have low income are the most harmed. Because as bad as inflation is here, inflation is deeply impacted and made worse by Brexit in the UK, because now there's all these tariffs. There's all these additional costs inherent in getting goods. Goods are more difficult to get. Many people in Europe are no longer exporting into the UK. So there's a shortage of goods. Like the rest of us are suffering from supply chains post-COVID. They've got that. Plus, a lot of small and medium-sized businesses just decided it wasn't worth the paperwork for that UK market. I mean, the UK is a big country, but it's not that big, right? So a European company can just decide, I'm not going to export my tea. I'm not going to export my meat. I'm not going to export my shirt. Whatever it is, I'm not going to do it. Even someplace like Etsy online, now they have to do paperwork to send you something in the UK. And so if you look on it, a lot of European Etsy sites are just saying, will not ship to the UK. They'd rather ship to me. There's less paperwork. Okay, so it means there's a deep shortage of goods, and what is there has become very expensive. This is critically happening in the wine category, which is bound to make everybody cranky, right? There's just not enough wine anymore in the UK, or cheese, both deeply problematic. Okay, so this is the geographic vote. This is Scotland. You have London, and you can see that Scotland in particular is overwhelmingly Remain. I mean, so is Gibraltar, and that's, again, another story. But Gibraltar has some real issues right now, but they're very small and people don't talk about them. But you can see that Scotland was overwhelmingly Remain, okay? As was Northern Ireland. This is Northern Ireland. So those cleavages overlap with these national cleavages causing problems. So what about economic? I've talked about it a little bit. There has been a massive exit of industry. I mean, Lloyd's of London is just the silliest because their name is actually London, and they are no longer based in London. But there has been a massive exodus of businesses. The UK, despite not being in the Eurozone, used to be a primary place for foreign investment because it was English speaking. Because of the longstanding ties with the US, companies like Microsoft, Google, Ford, they produced and built and set up European headquarters in the UK. They have all moved. Maybe some of them have left a rump business, but most of them have moved because they can't produce in the UK because then they have to pay tariffs to get into the EU. So they have all moved to other places because it is not economically feasible for those companies to continue to produce. So manufacturing has dropped precipitously. But even for services companies, you can't be based in the UK and operate. You can't, the services sector, which is the largest sector in every advanced industrial society, so that's things like lawyers and stock markets, and I guess I'm officially a service sector person. I can't export my goods anymore. I can't do it online anymore. I can't sell those goods anymore to the rest of Europe. And so I'm going to move. I'm going to incorporate somewhere else to try to get that done. We've had phenomenal currency instability. Some of you may have been paying attention when the pound dipped to near parity with the US dollar. I don't know about the rest of you, but the last time I was in the UK, it was like $1.50 to the pound. So that was crazy. I mean, the euro has also dropped, to be fair, but not by the same percentage, right? So there's been amazing instability. That particular drop, that was down to Liz Truss and her government, and it's come up a little bit. But the instability and the uncertainty around the pound is also an anomaly in the post-World War II period, right? The pound was one of those currencies that people would trust, right? And that is no longer true. One of my favorites, this right here is one of my favorites, is the inability to do new trade agreements. So the thing about being a member of the EU is that you don't do bilateral trade agreements. All trade agreements are done via the EU. And the UK was in the EU for 40 years. So guess what they didn't have? People trained in negotiating free trade agreements because they never did it. For 40 years, they didn't have to do it. And so the UK had to actually knock on Australia's door and say, hey, could you lend us some of your people who are trained in negotiating trade agreements? Because we legit don't have any. We just don't have any. We have none of the infrastructure to manage trade. There's no trade, like as a sector, because it's all managed through the EU during membership, right? So again, Great Britain is very much Little England in this case. So they haven't been able to. They've done two or three very minor trade agreements other than the negotiated trade agreement with the EU since Brexit. Now, granted, they've been working on other things, but without those trade agreements, right, the continued tariff on their goods is going to increase inflation and make it very, very difficult for UK citizens and for UK manufacturers because they can't sell their goods outside, not being able to export. So there's been a very high number of small and medium-sized industries, particularly small, particularly the cottage industries, that have gone under in the UK because they used to rely on very easy export to mainland, to main Europe. So people who made jams, right? People who made artisanal British cheeses. Those things would always be shipped into the UK into the EU for the expats, and now they can't be. There's no way for a small company to manage that paperwork. It is really arduous. And hopefully someday it will be simplified, but for right now, those companies have gone out of business. And again, it's difficult to know really truly how much of this is Brexit and how much is being impacted by COVID. And we have to take that seriously. But as the effects of the COVID shutdowns diminish, and as people return, I'm standing here in front of you without a mask, to normal business, it becomes increasingly clear what the impact of COVID is. And one of the easiest ways to see that is to look at the rest of Europe and see that they have lower rates of inflation, higher rates of growth than the UK, right? So that suggests that everybody had COVID, but the UK is recovering more slowly than the EU. And that may increase. It seems to be increasing. The difference seems to be increasing, but now we've got Giorgia Meloni in Italy and who knows what kinds of craziness, war in Ukraine. So, Europe's got its own problems right now. Here's just some statistics to back up what I've said. You can see that trade in goods and services is going up. I mean, Germany is always going up and particularly good. This was the low point of COVID and the path and the trajectory. And here you can see the UK, right? So it's not recovering as well as the other countries. And then just for a comparison, you have us, okay? Average direct investment, right? This is the Brexit vote. Direct investment falls precipitously. So other countries are not investing in the UK anymore because it's a very small island, all things considered. Why are you going to invest there? And then British pound, I did this, I was prepared for my talk. So I actually prepared this right before Liz Truss and the chaos. So I don't actually have I didn't read you the slide for that point where it would like fall below there, but you can still see this is Brexit and this is the pound, okay? So it's very clear. GDP growth, I mean, again, you've also got COVID. And so it's hard to disentangle this from COVID, but it's not good. And you can see that France is better, right? France is doing better. Trade deficits, the referendum, you can see the trade deficit is going up after Brexit for both imports and exports. So that's not good. And then systemic. This is the last subject. I don't think that there are many people who have any doubt that there will be another Scottish referendum, and I don't think that there's anybody who has any doubt what the outcome will be. When the Scots voted in 2014 and barely voted to stay within the UK, one of the primary reasons given in exit poll after exit poll was fear of not being part of the EU. That if they left the UK, and the UK was part of the EU, that would have meant that the UK could actually veto their membership in the EU, right? Because every member state can veto the membership of a new country. And they didn't think that the EU itself would really want to support them because there are other countries like Spain that have secessionist areas who might also be contrary to an independent Scotland. So that was one of the main reasons that Scottish nationalists decided to stay in the UK, because they deeply valued EU membership. And then 2 years later, right, the UK drags them out of the EU against their will. You saw that vote. They voted overwhelmingly to stay. And then to make matters worse, Scotland was not included in the negotiations between the EU and the UK. They were explicitly excluded, whereas because it was a coalition government, Theresa May had in her coalition the leader of the Democratic Union Party of Northern Ireland, which is the extreme right-wing pro-UK party of Northern Ireland, right? So the imbalance there, where this tiny little party who's very pro-UK and extremist would be allowed to participate in negotiations as part of the government, but Scotland and Nicola Sturgeon would not be allowed to, was extremely galling to Scotland. So increasingly, it is likely that Scotland will have an independence vote. The problem for Scotland is that the UK Parliament has to vote to give them the right to have a binding referendum on independence. And it is unclear when that will happen because nobody wants to lose Scotland under their watch. Most likely, there'll be a Labour government that makes a promise, like Cameron did, to give Scotland the vote, and then it'll come around and bite them in the butt. So that's the most likely scenario. The other option is that Scotland just holds the referendum a la the Catalonians, and then they say, deal with it. We're voting to secede, and I don't need you to approve it. And Scotland actually economically is viable as a standalone country. They have a military arsenal because of military bases there. They have nuclear power. They are, in fact, the home of most of the UK's nuclear power. They have had an independent bank for decades. There is a Scottish pound and a Scottish national bank. So they're actually pretty well established, and they are bigger than Malta or Cyprus or some of the other tiny countries that are part of the EU. There's like 3-point-something million people there. So they could do it, okay? And it is likely increasingly that they will. There is also really, really strongly an increased likelihood of a united Ireland because there's the Good Friday Agreement, again, the topic of another talk. But signatories to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 were the EU, the UK, the US, and Northern Ireland and Ireland. And that agreement said there shall be no border on the island of Ireland. So between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And so the result was, and nobody seemed to think about this during Brexit and what that would mean, because if you don't have a border on the island of Ireland, the only place you can put a border to keep the UK from the EU, because you've got to have that border control now, is in the sea, right? So now there is a border between shipments isolating Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. And people who live in Northern Ireland have the ability to have both passports, right? And now almost 90% of them do. I just saw a statistic that actually members of parliament in the UK, the number of members of parliament who have obtained Irish passports has astronomically gone up. It's like 347 or something now have obtained Irish passports. So they live under EU law. They are EU citizens, but their voters are not, right? And that made quite the big splash. So and polls in Northern Ireland, for the first time ever, you have more than 50% of people voting to join the Republic of Ireland. And the interesting thing about Ireland is that the Good Friday Agreement gives them the autonomy. They can decide at any point to hold that referendum. They have that right. And so it's a question of time. And honestly, it's a race to see whether it's Scotland or Northern Ireland that goes first. And for Northern Ireland, it will be very easy. It'll be just like Eastern Germany. They don't have to apply for EU membership. Scotland would. Scotland would have to apply, go through the Article 49 process. It would be pretty quick because they have most of the acquis communautaire. They already have most of the laws. But Northern Ireland, they just join Ireland, just like Eastern Germany joined Germany. There was no accession process. It was just approved. And there is no doubt that the rest of the EU would approve it. And so if and when they decide that have that referendum, it will be a very quick process. They will be members like that, and the UK is smaller, right? Because it'll just go through the Irish Sea. And then importantly, the long-term impacts of social polarization, they are unclear. But the UK isn't used to this level of polarization. I mean, honestly, neither are we here. And you can see that it's troubling and creating problems. And it's starting to create problems there as well, right? I mean, in Northern Ireland, you've seen a little bit of violence, and people are terrified of a return of the Troubles. And that may push the referendum vote faster. But even in the rest of the UK, you're starting to see increased political violence. And in Scotland, the Scottish nationalists have never been violent, really, but you're starting to see some violence, right? Low level, but it's there, and it's creating a lot of anxiety. So these are the regional splits and the referendums again. This is Scotland, and this is Northern Ireland. This is just London. Support for an independent Scotland. You can see that here's the Brexit referendum. It went up, and then for a while it looked like they were going to have a free trade agreement, like a Canada free trade agreement, and it wouldn't be that bad. And we thought that it would be okay. So support went down, and now it's gone back up. So the general belief is that there'll be support for it. COVID actually decreased support for an independent Scotland. There was a lot of feeling in Scotland that it would be very difficult to manage something like that on its own. And there will be a period between an independence vote and EU membership. And it could endure for more than a couple years, right? It could be 4, 5, 6 years between when you gain independence and when you're actually a member state. Even for Austria, Sweden, and Finland, who were EFTA countries, the accession process took a fair bit of time. And so a lot of people in Scotland are a little worried about what happens in that middle ground when you're not part of the UK and you're kind of isolated, right? You know where they are, but you're not part of the EU yet. And then the violence and no borders in Ireland. And one of the problems with that is, of course, that Northern Ireland, as the UK moves away in a regulatory sense from the EU, and they start to pass national regulatory laws, there is a bifurcation, and Northern Ireland becomes closer and closer economically to the Republic of Ireland because they are following those regulations, right? And so you're going to see a bifurcation as opposed to ensuring that they are parallel. And that's the border right now in the Irish Sea. And that's actually what the Conservatives are trying to back out of. The Conservatives are trying to get rid of this border in the Irish Sea, but there's no clear idea of where you would put it. I mean, there's no place to put it. Support for United Ireland, you can see that that's gone up. And conclusions. And that's just, it's just exactly what I've said. There's no, so that, I think that's it. Sure. Maybe. Bye.
great job. Very, very clear. And we learned a lot, my dear.
Thank you.
Any questions out there? Barbara.
Thank you.
Thank you for a most informative talk. I had been following the Brexit vote for many years while it was happening. And as an outsider, I was absolutely amazed at how it turned out. So my question is there any evidence of outside support for Brexit from countries that wanted to subvert the Western alliance?
There certainly were efforts. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not Russia planted trolls and things like that, and it's possible. Whether it was determinative, it's hard to say. The truth is, the Remain campaign was really poorly run because they were so sure they were going to win, right? So there might have been, and there was the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it was clear that there were external efforts to strengthen the Leave campaign, to target people on Facebook, to provide misinformation. That absolutely happened. But the Remain campaign didn't do itself any favors by not really aggressively campaigning and really trying to make clear to people that they had to go vote. Everybody kind of just acted like, this is annoying, but we'll be fine, you know? And so when that vote happened, I was on a plane and I was landing in Brussels to go to a conference, actually, on the EU, interestingly. And I landed and I turned on my phone, and that was the first thing that came out. And all of us in that cabin were just shocked because I would have bet money against it. I mean, nobody thought that Brexit was going to win. Honestly, because it just seems so stupid. Like, it just seems like such a bad choice. But, you know, if you can't take anything for granted, you have to campaign. You have to get people out to the polls. You have to make sure that people understand their interests in the short term and the long term. And the really difficult thing, and this is, you know, more global, is finding a good way to combat misinformation. And I don't know of one, or I would be a much more important person right now. But it's so easy to tell a lie and just keep repeating it. Like the bus, save your 350 million pounds. It was just a lie. It was just made up. It was a made up number about a made up thing. It had no connection to truth. But it's anybody in the UK can cite you that quote. Anybody will tell you that number. So how do you combat that is a very pervasive question, because that approach to politics is now everywhere. It's endemic. And the truth often just isn't as sexy, or it's just, well, that's what you think. You're like, no, that's a fact. It's a fact. It's just what you think. Well, I don't know what to say to that. I mean, I don't know how you combat that. So there was outside influence, as there is now in every single election everywhere. There was in the French presidential election, there was in the Italian election. So that's just endemic. I don't think it's what turned the tide in the Brexit vote.
Let's do a Zoom question real quick, Ron. We have Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, I posted it on. Anyway, to what extent do you know was the vote to exit driven by a rejection?
Larry, I'm sorry, repeat it, repeat.
Okay. To what extent was the vote to exit driven by a rejection of continued immigration of minority populations?
So I think that the rhetoric was absolutely there, and a lot of the rhetoric was anti-immigrant. Fun fact, the EU doesn't pass immigration policy for member states. It is one of the areas that is not shared. So every member state sets its own immigration policies for non-EU members, okay? So that picture of refugees, those were not EU member state citizens marching into the UK. They were refugees from Syria who were heading into Eastern Europe. And that was the framing, was that we were gonna get all kinds of very different people with different beliefs. I mean, what we're saying here is people of color and probably Muslims. And the EU doesn't set that policy for member states. The only thing that the EU says is that if it's an EU citizen, they get to come to your country. And even then, you can set limits on access to social security and welfare. You can set limits on permanent residency. You can set limits on state support. So the EU doesn't set those policies. So wherever you are, Larry, the rhetoric was absolutely used, but in fact, immigration of non-EU members has increased since Brexit. And thank goodness for the UK, because otherwise they would literally have no one working at the NHS. So what they've done, hey, how you doing? So they've created, oh, Larry's up there. Okay, hi, Larry. So they've created a situation in which lots of foreigners feel threatened. There was a lot of anti-Polish violence, and a lot of Polish people left. A lot of Polish people work in healthcare and domestic care, and now there's a severe shortage. I mean, again, like here, we have a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, but you know what? If we don't have immigration, nobody's picking your vegetables. And that's a problem. So the rhetoric was used. It was a false use of it because that is a policy that is set by the member states, not the EU. So it has always been up to the UK government. And if you didn't have them, you'd have problems anyway, economic problems. You know, the modern economies require immigration. Also, just by the way, from a demographic point of view, every single country in Europe has a declining birth rate. Do you know why the US does not have a declining birth rate? Because immigrants make babies and the rest of us don't. And if we don't, and that matters for your economics, but goodness, it also matters for your security. Because where do soldiers come from? They come from young people. And if you're not making any young people, you don't have any soldiers. So there's actually a security crisis across Europe because they are not making babies. So you got to unpack that. I mean, it's fine to be afraid of people who are different, but modern industrial economies actually depend on immigration for their economies and for their growth in a wide variety of ways. So that's just my little pet peeve.
We have a question back here.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I'm more concerned about the impact of the troubles coming back. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that, because you know, if you put the boundary somewhere in Ireland, you're going to have the people in Northern Ireland, or a very small minority of them at least, who are going to fight like hell. And I don't see how you come out from that.
The Northern Irish question is probably the most difficult question of Brexit, and it is one that got very little attention during the Brexit campaign. And that is just the truth. And there were lots of people, especially academics, jumping up and down and screaming and saying, what are you going to do about Northern Ireland? And people just poo-pooed it and said it won't be a problem. You know, in the government at that time, Theresa May and later Boris Johnson were like, we'll figure it out. They promised that there wouldn't be a border in the Irish Sea, but they also promised that there wouldn't be a border on the island of Ireland. You can't have both. And so there is a border in the Irish Sea, and there will probably remain a border in the Irish Sea because the UK signed an international agreement with the EU saying that's where the border is, and the EU is not willing to change it. And so the only way that that can change is if the UK defaults, but then the border goes wherever the EU says it goes, right? So I don't think that there will be a border on the island of Ireland because pretty much everybody agrees that you can't go back and you can't have the troubles. If there is a vote to unite the republic, to unite the island, there will be violence. There is no doubt that the people in the DUP will rebel because that is not what they want. They see themselves as British. And you can understand how if you said, oh no, you're not British, you're now Irish, and you're going to go to Ireland, some people are going to object to that. That is absolutely true. And that's why there's not a push to have a referendum today, right? They're biding their time. And in Northern Ireland right now, they can live as if they are members of the EU because they have Irish passports. Anybody who wants an Irish passport can have an Irish passport. So you can have the best of both worlds. So there isn't a lot of pressure right now to push a referendum because there's a great deal of fear and trepidation about violence, understandably, after the Troubles. And so they will wait until the percentage of people who support unification with Ireland isn't at 60% or 58%, but it's at 85% or 90%, because then it's unquestionable, right? Then you can't debate the public support. And you have to be able to get people from the Protestants also wanting it. And they will, once it becomes clear that it is economically by far in their interests. And that's what will eventually happen. But it may take time, and there's no interest in pressuring right now. It may take centuries. I don't think so. I mean, I think it'll be in my lifetime. I think it'll be within the next couple decades.
Okay, am I online?
I think so.
I guess I am. Well, another problem is the current British Prime Minister. You know, supposedly he's this wealthy guy that's his critics have mentioned that he's out of touch. You know, he's this gazillionaire. And now I don't mean to prejudice you against gazillionaires, but they say that, oh, he is really out of touch and he doesn't, have anything in common with the common people. And he's another guy who's not going to do anything with the current problems. So I wish you would comment on that.
Well, it's not like David Cameron or John Major or Theresa May were poor. In general, British prime ministers have come from the Eton class, not from the working class. So in that sense, Rishi Sunak is no different. He isn't from an aristocratic line. He didn't go to Eton. He does have the benefit of being brown, which is a first in the UK, and it has certainly given him a good deal of support and actually weakened Labour, because traditionally people of color in the UK support Labour more. And so seeing yourself up there, that's always really useful and really helpful for people, especially young people. He is also a trained economist. And given Liz Truss's performance, and Liz Truss, by the way, was working class, or as close to it as you can come in British politics. And what did she do? She went in there guns blazing, trying to cut the taxes of the bazillionaires and increase the taxes on the working class. So not really a clear model. It was like she had a chip on her shoulder and something to prove that even though she was working class, she was a true conservative. So I don't think that they'll make much of it, as they always do. They did for Boris Johnson too. But what will matter is his understanding of economics. And I think I'm not a fan of Rishi Sunak, to be clear. I don't know who I'd be a fan of in British politics right now, but he is a trained economist. And I am kind of a believer in technocrats, right? Sometimes you just want the philosopher kings in there. Sometimes you just want the people who know what they're doing. He is an economist. He understands how economics works. And while there are no good choices, there are some really bad choices, as Liz Truss demonstrated. And so I am hopeful that he will be able to avoid some of the really bad choices. So I don't have strong feelings about him one way or the other. Honestly, he's not going to last. There will be general elections within 2 years. That would be my money. And the Labour Party will win. And, Keir Starmer's okay, but I'm not a huge fan of him either. So,
One last question.
Has Brexit had any impact on the defense agreements under NATO?
Yes and no. The one area where the UK lost the most by the loss of the UK is actually in its military prowess, in its defense. The UK is a strong military power. And part of that comes from the quote unquote special relationship with the US. And part of that comes just from having been an empire for so long and having lots of boats, right? So they are a military player, and the EU is weaker as a military actor as a result. They are both in NATO, and they collaborate in NATO. And one of the things that the US really pushed for under Obama and Trump, actually, and now Biden, is to ensure that within NATO, differences that have to do with Brexit are not played out in NATO. And that the agreements that were made in the context of when the UK was a member state remain. And that's why there has been pressure to resolve the Eurofighter, right? Because that was part of the EU's contribution. It's part of the commitment that member states in the EU made to increase their defense spending, which was initiated under Obama, but really came to the fore under the Trump presidency. So it didn't make things any easier. But honestly, NATO has bigger problems in terms of the relationship between Turkey and the rest of the EU, or Turkey and Greece and the rest of the EU. So in the security arena, thus far, it hasn't been a significant issue, but thus far, everybody's been on the same side. Like if you think about Ukraine, right? The UK government has been as strong in terms of supporting Ukraine as has the EU as a whole. And so they've been able to work and ally and negotiate and collaborate in that effort actually quite effectively. And that actually gives hope that eventually, when all of this is, sort of simmered down and we have a new status quo, there will be a working relationship, and it will be okay for all involved, right? And the decision has been made. I don't expect the UK to reapply in my lifetime. I mean, that I don't expect. I could be wrong, but I don't think so, because the trauma is just too much. And what everybody in the UK wants is to not talk about it anymore, is to not have it be front and center of the political discourse every single day. And so if you had to do a referendum to rejoin, and then you had to do the negotiations to rejoin, it would just put it front and center again. And so I think for a very long time, the effort is going to be on developing a working relationship and refining that working relationship, and probably moving towards deeper economic ties, because it's in everybody's best interest once the political rhetoric dies away. And it can still count as Brexit, right? I mean, there was a lot of fear that if you had a customs agreement, then Brexit wouldn't mean Brexit. They'll probably end up somewhere very close to Norway, which is, we follow all the rules that you make us follow. We don't get to have a say in any of the rules that you make us follow. But if we didn't follow all the rules that you make us follow, we would be badly off economically. So we're going to do it. And that will probably be what evolves over time, just because it's rational. You can say you're not in the EU. You can say you have your independence. You can cut out certain sectors. For Norway, it's oil and fisheries that you get to do your own thing on. But by and large, you do what they do because you want to be able to trade with them. And you have to meet their regulatory standards, right? The UK can set its own regulatory standards for the safety of electronic equipment or the density of a down pillow. But if they want to sell that stuff to the EU, they have to meet EU stipulations, just like we do. And so you can say, okay, I'm not going to do that, but they are the second largest trading bloc in the world, and they are right there. So it's really cheap to get your stuff there. Or you can try to send it over here in an ocean, in a carrier, on a container ship that we don't even have containers for right now, right? I mean, what are your options? You're going to do it.
Okay, thank you very much, Amie, for a really good program. Now, next week will be our final week, and we're going to turn to the subject of populism in Europe. And I think the code word for populism is right-wing populism. And we'll find out about that because that is one of the undercurrents that everybody in Europe is having to deal with. Now, it'll be a very interesting way to wrap up the session. Thank you. See you next week.
Wait. The guy who's coming to speak to you next week is my graduate student. Be nice to him. He's very bright, but he gets a little nervous. So be nice.